Welcome to the Public Good App House, where we explore the most pressing issues at the intersection of technology, nonprofits, and social impact. Today, we're going deep with Dan Hon, one of the leading voices in civic technology and digital transformation. Dan has been at the forefront of reimagining how government and public services can work better for everyone, from helping to shape California's strategic technology plan to driving digital turnarounds for federal agencies and nonprofits. In this conversation, Dan and I unpack the changing landscape of civic tech, government, and nonprofit technology. We explore how organizations can adapt to increasing security threats and what it means to build public interest technology in an era of political polarization. Dan brings decades of hands-on experience and insights to help us understand what's at stake and how we can thoughtfully respond to this moment. And so before we dive in, let's establish some shared definitions to ground the conversation. Dan, tell us, how do you distinguish between civic tech, government tech, and nonprofit technology in your work?
All right. Okay, so here's one thing. Civic tech doesn't work, government tech doesn't work, and non-profit tech doesn't work. None of them work as well as they should do. But more seriously, I'll start with government tech. Government tech is, I would say, the technology that our administrative bureaucracy needs for a functioning society. So that kind of thing is, and if we think about technology from that perspective, we know from history that computers were pretty much invented as a way to deal with the administrative state, right? So way back in time, before I try not to think about how old I am now, but way back in time, we start having the first databases in the states to deal with things like health insurance, to deal with things like social security, to deal with things like tax. So as soon as we needed to deal with millions of people, then that created the need for this type of processing. So that what I see as broadly government technology is the stuff that we have agreed to in our social contract. So the stuff that people vote people in and then they agree to provide certain programs and we have to administer them. And countries and states are just so big now that we use computers to do that. So that's just using software, using the combination of software and hardware to do that. Otherwise, we'd be doing it on pen and paper. So that's the broad bucket of government tech. I think more specifically, civic tech in the way that we've been thinking about it and that we've seen it over the last 20 years now. I think the canonical example, and I would see civic tech as being from the non-government side, right? So that's an easy way to distinguish it, which is civic tech is anything that isn't made by government, has a primarily, I would say, speaking off the top of my head, like a societal purpose. It's probably got a big interface with government. So one of the canonical examples are things like reporting potholes. This is way back in my Code for America days. There's a pothole in this road. My city government doesn't know about it. There should be an easy way of telling my city government that there's a pothole. No one's making it. I'm going to make it as a member.
Fix my street, was it? What
Right,
was it?
fix my street, that was adopt a drain or something.
Yeah.
So all that kind of stuff where I would say it comes from that Web 2.0 world where people started to realize, and this is, the whole doc sales thing, the web is a conversation. We can actually, it doesn't have to be broadcast, it can be bottom up as well. So I see civic tech as fulfilling that kind of democratic, bottom up, self-organizing use of technology to achieve social goals. So it can be anything, and in that way you can kind of draw a very wide net around civic tech, because you could read that and you could say, I live in Portland, Oregon, and I could say, well, the Portland subreddit might not be civic tech, but if someone made a bot for city subreddits and that bot was good at spotting things like people complaining about potholes on subreddits, and that bot had a way to submit those to cities, then that tiny bit of software and technology inside a city subreddit, from my point of view, that counts as civic tech. That's the use of technology to further a social goal or to further a social aim or to bring people together. At the other end of that, you've got stuff like Nextdoor, which I would put in the VC funded end of the spectrum of civic tech. So clearly there's a gradient there with, all right, well, there's your overt purpose. And I think probably one of the ones that I would see as most I'd put, I think, is it Citizen? Citizen's the crime reporting app. And I would put what was formerly called ShotSpotter. They might call themselves at a push Civic Tech. They are more like, from my point of view. So Citizen is the one where I think you can report crimes that are happening, and then you get a real-time feed of all the terrible stuff that's happening in your neighborhood to put you in a constant state of fear. ShotSpotter is the allegedly not very accurate, and in some cases allegedly outright fabricating the tracing of gunshot, the tracing of gun usage in cities. So they use this network of microphones and sensors, and so that gets sold. And if I were being incredibly cynical in marketing, then I might call that civic tech, and they say, yeah, right, this is for the populace. This is keeping everyone safe. This is technology for civics. And then some other examples of civic tech that we've got, you might go all the way to stuff like WordPress. You might go all the way to citizen engagement stuff. Right. So, and I think that's a wave that we had in terms of citizen engagement platforms when there was this trend or this wave of local governments realizing that, oh, there are ways that we can use the internet to ask people things. I think, and this might be a slight diversion into the current tech environment, Facebook and Twitter, I suppose I can still call it X because X is a very different thing now. I think Facebook and X fell into, without anyone paying proper attention or strategically, fell into the space of civic tech. Because just from the perfectly rational act of people saying, you know what, I need to communicate with my constituents. I should go where the audience is. I should go where people are. People are on Facebook. I will create a Facebook page for this police department, right? I will create a Facebook page for the fire department. I'll create a Facebook page for the county health department. I'll have a Twitter,
school,
right?
Yeah,
your district and everything, right? Like that.
Yeah.
And then you could make an argument that, okay, as soon as that becomes technology that is critical or close to critical, right? Or the default for a resident's or a parent's, communication with a school or a school district, then that's where you start getting that blurry line, I think, between the civic tech part and the government tech part, because the civic tech part, that's the, Facebook groups lets parents set up a PTA group on Facebook, right? Kind of civic-y. But then you've got government usage of these platforms. And I think I can very quickly say that maybe there are issues when critical government and public services have kind of boxed themselves into a corner of having to use platforms that they do not control, do not have enough control over. And then that leaves nonprofit tech. Nonprofit is a bit harder. Let's have a think about that. So nonprofit tech, so let's say that that's going to be non-commercially funded, right? So it might have its main source of funding from institutional funding, or it may be funded by charitable donations. And I think that encompasses the suite of everything, just like in government, all the infrastructure that you need to do what the point of the particular nonprofit is. So I was working on something last year with a foundation where they were researching how local community news organizations use text messaging, right? In the form of just regular news and journalism, and also in the form of service journalism. So you've got a local newspaper, and there's a power outage, and it turns out that the local newspaper, the community newspaper, does a better job of you texting, where can I get, is the boil notice still on, or where can I get clean water, or is this thing open? And they do a better job of that than, say, your traditional private equity owned local newspaper or your local government services. So that stack is all the way from, either the in-house developed SMS technology that those nonprofit newsrooms might be developing and cobbling together, to third-party SaaS that does send text messages for you, and then some of those are geared towards nonprofits, or it might be, whatever. Oh, I can't remember. Twilio, Twilio's got a whole bunch of stuff that's aimed at nonprofits.
Yep.
All the way through to how nonprofits use stuff like Zapier, how they use things like WordPress, how they use things like Google Docs, and how they use things like Slack. So there's the operational stuff. And then I think there's the, which I think there's a whole problem with in general. And then there's the, is there something that this nonprofit is doing that is special, that is only because of its unique use of technology? So there's one way in which, the nonprofit technology part is we just need this operationally to do what we're doing. I know, like Audubon, until Audubon does something like, here, you can help us do a survey, right? And you can help us identify which birds are where. Then the which birds are where infrastructure, then that is specific to Audubon. And then they've got all the operational stuff as well.
Let's call it the purpose built. I've traveled some years as well through these sort of eras of technology development, starting in Web 2 to now. And I've seen this nonprofit tech scene kind of struggle to get a critical mass and civic tech. I mean, I've seen civic tech kind of
Yeah,
rise with millions and millions of dollars of funding. The Knight Foundation was instrumental in making that whole space
yeah,
grow, and Code for America exploded. And now that civic tech meme is, I don't know where it is, of course, but public good technology is an increasingly more public interest technology
yeah, yeah.
is now a more dominant framing, and public good technology on for some. And so it's useful to kind of just do this parsing, because for many folks they haven't traveled through those eras, and it's a good sort of foundation to step off from. So
So I think there's something interesting there when you illustrate, cynically the rebranding of civic tech into public interest or public good technology. But I think if you want to be more generous about it, I think it
mm,
reflects a a recognition of ultimately what it takes for civic technology to be that type of technology, whatever you call it, for it to be sustainable in today's frankly shitty, horrific, late capitalism environment. Which is that because we know that there are a bunch of core costs, right? If you're developing, for example, that purpose technology, right? Then you've got a recurring cost. It isn't in the failure mode that we've seen in government. It isn't, we'll do a big bang, we'll treat it like a capital cost. I'm the Knight Foundation. I will give you a grant of $500,000 to develop this software. And then there's no real plan for sustainability. I think one of the smart things about kind of nudging this a bit into the realm of public good technology or public interest technology is that I think it makes it a little bit clearer that if something is a public good or if something is in the public interest, then we're more likely to see that as something that we collectively fund or that we collectively support in some way rather than, for example, here's some money. Maybe you can make some tech that happens to serve the public interest. Maybe you can figure out a way to make money off it. And I think what we're increasingly seeing is for the things that we see as critical public infrastructure, we need to look for, we're at the point where we're like, okay, well, we tried that. Pretending to be a startup didn't quite work because you can always get, if you even show the slightest bit of being good at it, then you'll get outcompeted by Facebook or, MailChimp will say, oh, wait, actually, we're going to do that. And I guess as an institutional funder, you may look at that from the 30,000-foot view and say, well, that might not be so bad because there was a need that was identified for software that technology that didn't exist. We proof of concepted it, and then the market copied it, and then now the traditional enterprise market is filling that need. And I'm like, okay, well, that is better than before. It's not as good as I would like it. Because especially if if one of your choices is, well, this didn't exist before, it kind of exists now. Oracle say that they do it, and I just pay through the nose for Oracle to do it for me, and it's just bad. It's as if we just had the same thing as before, or we just had worse, right? So
yeah,
I do think public interest or public good is an attempt, or I'd make it up in my head as an attempt to recontextualize. Okay, well, if we start thinking about this as infrastructure, then what are the models for that infrastructure to exist? Like we don't have one standard road, but we have standards for roads. lots of different people can make roads. There are lots of different ways of funding roads. You can have toll roads. You can have, the federal government will chip in money if it's a certain kind of road. States will pay for it. You might raise a bond measure for something. I don't know. But I think, and this might be the original sin of, the technology world as it was, which was I can make an investment in something and then someone will do it in a startup kind of way. And then, magic will happen and then hockey stick will happen. And it's kind of, we step back from that a bit and we were like, well, who's going to pay for this? Because government might pay for it a bit, but that brings us back into kind of a wider conversation with a wider democratic conversation, right? Which is, well, what kind of society do we want to live in? And what should government provide at what service level that we feel entitled to? So then when you look at that, I would look at companies like ProPal and some of the other, like the new Snap and EBT companies that come up, right? So they're not what I would put in the traditional government tech space. Definitely, I would say more in the civic tech space. They have a very defined customer, right? So they will go to, if it's county or if it's state administered, they will do deals with EBT administrators or staff administrators, for example, and then you can use this service, right? So
Mm.
they've identified the market to work that way. So depressingly or unsurprisingly, I think a lot of this comes down to, well, are we able to identify a need? What's the nature of that need? Is it more like an infrastructural critical need that we may not have thought about before? And if so, do we want it to be in the hands of, say, 1 to 3, technology platform behemoths? In which case we would get it for free. Or if we're not going to get it for free, then how do we develop it and how do we sustain it? And who owns that process, right, as well? So this is like governments have tried before in a smart way to put together consortia. So we see that in unemployment insurance in the States, right? It's like 3 or 4 states will get together and will say, well, unemployment insurance is really big and expensive, but we think
Mm.
that most states have common needs. So 3 of us will
Mm.
get together and then maybe we'll get something slightly cheaper than if each of us tried to go our own way with it.
Mm.
We get a little
Mm.
bit of economy of scale there.
Yeah, I think there's this nuance between customer and beneficiary that's often glossed over in the sort of PowerPoint or even in the organizational consciousness. It's like the customer is the one paying and has the need, and the beneficiary is the person benefiting, right? The most, or ideally benefiting, like we're building it to benefit that user. And that's a tricky distinction.
Yeah, it's something that has stuck around in my head a lot, and it's something that Dave Garino did at Code for America, somewhat following the footsteps of what the government digital service did in the UK, which was to really hammer home that the service is for the actual users.
Mm.
And one of the ways that they did that was to take, in the UK's example, the minister in charge of the service and then get the minister to use that service. And then, unsurprisingly, they find out exactly how shit it is. And then that's a bit of a litmus test moment because you find out, does this person actually care about what their job is supposed to be? Or, are they just waiting? And if they actually care, then they're going to start asking, well, what can we do about it?
Mm.
And I think we so the thing that I've been pushing, for example, is when you get to a big enough technology build where someone with significant bureaucratic disasters, is bearing the scars, then they might ask for something called IV&V, which is independent verification and validation. This is a requirement in a lot of government technology projects. It's like, fine, you're getting Deloitte in to do something. We'll get someone else to go and check that Deloitte are doing what they're supposed to be doing. All the source code's done, all the tests are done in the right way. And that's all like an ISO standard and everything. What that IV&V has never done has been go back and then do user testing and user research with it. And I see if we're serious about meeting the needs if government is serious about meeting the needs of constituents,
Mm.
then they would have a feedback loop that would include, okay, at every stage and continually, we want the report on what it's like for regular people to use this. And we want to use that to manage the development of this technology, whether it's in-house, whether it's external, whether it's an external contractor vendor, or even if it's, we bought Salesforce. Okay, we're going to buy Salesforce to run a child welfare service. That's great. You can do that. Maybe you're saving a bunch of money. Maybe it helped you develop something way faster than in-house would have done, which is fantastic. I still want you to go, every quarter to be able to put a report in front of your state legislature, for example, right? Or your county government to say, we got 100 people to use this. And, it turns out that 87 of them didn't understand what it meant, or they couldn't finish their task. So what are we going to do about it? Because the point of this legislation, or the point of this, it goes right down to the social contract is, well, we voted for this and we're giving you money for it. And it turns out that we can't actually get it. We're not going to put any blame anywhere until there's evidence that we need to, right? We're going to assume that everyone's trying to do a good job. And this goes into, it's kind of the approach that I take with the clients that I work with, is everyone's trying to do a good job. I'm not going to think that you're trying to explicitly not stop people from receiving what they're entitled to. So if we want to do a good job, then what are we going to do about it? And, we need to know where we stand right now. And there's nothing, there is nothing technically stopping us from doing that. It is possible for us to do that. And then this is like a leadership decision, or this is kind of a courage decision.
It feels to me like this is a function of the industrial era colliding with the digital era, where the feedback loops just weren't even viable pre 1999 for the most part. And now without the feedback loop, USAID goes away. Pick your flavor of government service or nonprofit entity. The ability to verify and validate the value you're delivering without the feedback loop in place via software at scale exposes all of these entities.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And it's like, well, can we, how do you have a conversation about that? How do you stand on common ground in that conversation when it's just sort of a budget cutting exercise? Which brings us to the political environment. And I want to ask you about like this. There's probably some non-obvious ways this political polarization affects how you actually go about and build what I will be calling public good technology in this conversation. How, or what are you seeing, or how are you thinking about the build in an increasingly polarized environment? These particular conditions force us to approach the design and the building of things in ways that are unique to this particular moment in time. And now this moment is maybe a decade long. Tell us about some of the non-obvious ways this polarization has affected your approach to building.
I'm just going to speak off the top of my head, and that it might end up being a little bit of a retrospective, or a little bit of a history lesson, all right? So one of the bits of federal government that I've worked with has been the Office of Head Start. And for people who aren't familiar, this is, I think, an Obama era program that basically said, you know what, in general, it's good if as many kids can go to preschool as possible, right? Like this is just a generally good thing for our society. So then it pumps out a bunch of money for there to be, from my understanding, preschool positions and places for kids to get early education, because early education and early intervention is good, right? It's just good for society. So a bunch of money goes into that. And then we skip forward to, I don't know, 2 days ago, and then Elon Musk tweets that this is a waste of money and it's terrible and we should just cut it. And then some other context here is that, it is a state, and then I think maybe county administered program, right? So I think, like a lot of federal programs, you've got the Office of Head Start, and then states work with it, and then states ask for the money from the Fed, and then the money gets dispersed that way, or it works region by region, for example. So then you have an end run around that, which is someone can say, hey, just don't give them any money anymore. And you have software that does that. When it comes down to it, there is pretty much, and this was the instance when people were talking about, I think Ron Wyden had said maybe, God, was it on Saturday or Friday? He said, yeah, we've checked and then 30 states can't access their Medicaid portal. And a bunch of people thought, well, that's just a portal. Who cares about a portal? And my understanding is that that portal is where states upload essentially what would be their equivalent of claims so that they can get paid their whatever hundreds of millions or billions worth of dollars to keep their health system, to keep Medicaid running in their state. And the way that a lot of states are run is that that's on a cash flow basis. So if the money doesn't come, then, your state may well be insolvent from that moment on because it just relies on that money coming through. Now, shitty Elon Musk might have a lot of reasons for thinking that Head Start is a waste. Starting from anything that government does is a waste. But we can put that aside and we'll say, well, you know what? We will agree with all of this, neolibertarian, data-driven government stuff, right? So we want to be able to show that the money that we're spending is actually making a difference. So then we've got to be very carefully minded about the data that we're going to collect, how we're going to collect it, and how we're going to transparently show, as easily and as clearly as possible that this is worth it. You might want to know right at the very end of it, at your county level. And this is stuff that I think, can't remember, not Steve Ballmer, maybe Steve Ballmer, who runs like the USA Facts site or something like that, right? It's like transparency in general is a good thing because it can increase trust in government. So if I'm here in Multnomah County, and if I happen to want to, I can go and see, yeah, there are however many Head Start programs and they're doing this well, compared to us not having a Head Start program, then I may never look at that, but it's just good that that exists in case someone wants to look at that down the line. I don't think, because it's just really, really hard to figure out what to collect and what to report. I think it's incredibly hard to do a good job at that. And then you've got to do a good job of that all the way up to the federal level. And there are so many ways of doing that badly. So you've got the first problem of, okay, well, let's decide what it is that we actually have to measure, why we're measuring it, and why it's important. Then we've got to figure out, this is the whole bureaucratic state, right? How are we going to measure it? Because we know that there are the shitty ways of measuring it, which is we're sending you this form in the mail, and then you, as a recipient ultimately of Head Start funds, you've got to fill in this thing by hand, and then you've got to do it. And then you've got the less shitty version, which is someone took the PDF and put the PDF online, and then you've got to fill in the PDF online. And then maybe, 5 years later, maybe 18F or USDS or a civic tech company comes in and says, we should do a user-centered redesign of this entire, think of this as a service. So this is a service so that recipients of Head Start funds can just get on with the business of doing a great job of providing childcare, right? What they want to do is they want to provide great childcare. They do not want to have to spend a shit ton of time, doing all of this reporting stuff, which, as a side thing, I will say, my understanding is that institutional funders also put a very large reporting burden on nonprofits that are receiving funding from them. So then we have all of these parts, which is, okay, well, what do we collect? Why do we collect it? How do we collect it in the easiest way? How do we do it in terms of, for example, and this is a perennially US problem, which is, but they already have my information. Why do I have to enter my information again, right? So all of that. And right now we also have the issue of, well, how do we safeguard privacy? How do we assure that PII is going to be safe all the way up? Because now you get to reports that, one of Musk's teenagers or recent college grads, is over at the Office of Personnel Management. And I think I saw someone describe this in a pretty good way, is that if you know enough about the technology that runs government, what's been happening over the last 3 days is a bit like the January 6th storming of the Capitol. It is people going in and they are breaking shit. They are pulling plugs out. They are going through all the filing cabinets. But these aren't filing cabinets. These are the personnel records and the social security, numbers and everything of, 2 million federal employees.
Hmm.
And, one of the, I can imagine that one of the ways of doing that is you just need account access to that Oracle ERP system, right? Or that PeopleSoft system or that SAP system, right? As soon as you have the credentials for that, then you are in. And one way that we've seen the more libertarian tech world deal with this is through end-to-end encryption, where Apple will say, we can be subpoenaed by the feds for your iCloud backup, but we can't read your iCloud backup. We cannot give them the key, right? The key is on your device, right? And we've made it so that if anyone has to give them the key, then you need to give them the key because it's your data. It's encrypted that way. So those are the types of, I think, considerations that people might be thinking about now, which I would say, given how much work needed to be done to bring our systems up to even a reasonable standard for 20, I mean, I've been doing this for 9 years, at least 9 years now. So let's say even a reasonable standard for 2015, right? We had all of this stuff to do. And at the same time, now it's not like we never had to do this, but now there's also, well, what if there's a bad actor inside the system? What are the risks there? How does government, if it's acting at a government level, how does it preserve the rights and the privacy of the people who are the beneficiaries, like you're saying, not the users, but the beneficiaries of that data that's in there, because the government is supposed to be able to assure that. So I say, I don't know if I have anything more insightful to say that other than it's very, very complicated. And I think this is the latest illustration of, and amusingly, I think it's one of the ones that the founding of America was most concerned about was what do you do when the government has your data? And how do you ensure that the government doesn't use that in a bad way? I think the issue with this is that it requires a level of knowledge and experience, and this is something that I've talked about before in terms of the technological and software machinery of government that does not exist, and that clearly did exist, because if you go back to the beginning of this conversation, I say stuff like, well, government helped invent computers in the first place. All right, your IRS record is one of the oldest database records, around. So governments were clearly capable of this. They did it when they had to do it. They invented it. But
It's a big jump. It's a big jump, though, from military industrial complex to delivering on services to citizens.
I mean, kind of. But then you look at these systems, and I've gotten in trouble for being, quite frankly, rude about mainframe systems, right? Rude about how difficult they are to change. Rude about how, for example, they don't have many of them don't have automated testing in place, right? So it's still a whole bunch of three-ring binder, you know,
Mm.
type this thing in and then see if it works. One example,
Mm.
which is fantastic, I think, is there's a giant transaction database in California, right? And the way that they find out that they have implemented conflicting program policy is when that gets encoded into the mainframe system, and when they try and run it, then it throws an exception and it falls over, because those two policy directives that no one really would have thought of in that way, they actually conflict when you actually try to run it, the set of instructions. So I got in trouble for saying, your crappy mainframe system, and they very politely pointed out and said, this hasn't fallen over. It works every single day and it moves the money every single day. It may be hard for us to do new stuff, but it is reliable.
Mm.
Right. So it is that if the scope of the service was a lot smaller back in, say, the 1950s, 1960s, right? It was you pay your money in and then you get your social security check. So maybe one way to think about it is that in the past we thought about it more as, number of completed transactions and not the accuracy of a transaction. And then if a transaction isn't accurate, then how do what's your exception process for that? And then how do you go and then correct that inaccuracy in the transaction? So it's like,
Mm.
yay, we got like, I don't know, 50 million social security checks out. We have to fix 1,000 of them. okay, we can fix 1,000 of them. But the deal is that we get, 50 million of them out every single time. It's the throughput there, or it's kind of good enough.
I'm thinking about the audience and the mental model that you're holding right now in the midst of this pretty much a black swan. I don't know if you anticipated this level of disruption, but I surely didn't. So my question is in along the lines of what's a good way to think about your data if you're running a public benefit organization like a nonprofit at the moment in the midst of this disruptive period. I mean, like
Right.
what's the what's the right mental model, and
So yeah, so
how are you rethinking your mental model of government technology as we move through this, just the beginning of this new administration?
so I think one of the, not necessarily a secret, but the way that it was dealt with was just crossing your fingers and hoping, was that something like the USDS and something like 18F have not accidentally been used for good since they were founded, but they have been used for good since they've been founded, and their use has been at the direction of, for example, 18F sits inside GSA, sits inside TTS, Technology Transformation Service, and USDS sits, with the office of the president. So, you that all that traces back to Obama saying, "No, I want my own team to go in, and I'm going to give them my authority to go and take a look at and to help fix this," which is
Hmm.
great. So the failure model of all of that is that now you have a whole bunch of USDS people deployed into government. They know what they're doing and what happens when they get told to do something that is illegal, right? What happens when they get told to do something that is, that they may morally feel is, counter to what the entire point of the legislation is, or even, actually I have to wait for Congress to tell me to do this, even though I could literally, sit, log in at a shell and I could, throw a spanner in it so that this doesn't work. Congress is supposed to tell me, through that chain of command to do it that way. And this is where it gets a little bit difficult because this is, I think, where it illustrates that it's it's never really the technology, it's always people and it's always people problems, right? But it's the how can we use technology to help as much as possible. I think where people get stuck is, people will say, "Oh, we can use technology so we don't have to worry about the people problem." And it's like you're always going to have to worry about a people problem. Technology is only going to get you so far, so you can't use it as a backstop. It's not going to be the thing that will completely do it. But I think right now it's a bit like if I were a well-funded nonprofit and the kind that actually had a budget for stuff like cybersecurity and that might even have a budget for red team
Well,
penetration testing and
that's less
testing.
than
Right,
1%. What's
right,
that,
right.
1%?
Yeah, like I imagine, like I don't know, Audubon's pretty big, NPR's pretty big. I
Yeah,
would be
yeah,
surprised if they had a budget or if they had ever done, I'm pleasantly surprised, but I'd be surprised if they ever had the money to do that.
yeah.
But now I think it's very much you need to model what happens when the bad guys come and the bad guys come after your data. And how important is it to your organization about the duty that your organization, think about the duty that your organization owes to its beneficiaries and the risk model to its beneficiaries. Like, how much do you care about the people that your nonprofit is aimed towards? And then in some cases, it's going to be super, I would hope it's super obvious. So if you provide, reproductive health care, then I would hope, for example, you've been talking to organizations like EFF for quite a while now, and you would be thinking about, again, this same example. Fine, we can be subpoenaed by whoever, right? But it's been end-to-end encrypted in a way that we, the operators of the service, we have no idea what's in there, right? And thinking again end to end, and this is why it comes to the red team type exercise. You want to come in, and it's like if any of these organizations have done, you know, your user journey when you're developing your new service, right? And you're doing it in all the right ways. You're doing your user research, you're doing your content design, and you do your user journey. And this is the equivalent of you do your user journey for someone who's a complete dick and wants to destroy everything. What can they get at every single point?
Yeah, they didn't include that in the human-centered design or whatever the last successful meme was for
Yeah, yeah, whatever
turning
came out of
business people
video the
into
last
design.
time. Yeah,
Right,
Thinking.
yeah,
yeah,
design thinking. That's the one. That's the one. Right,
yeah. Everyone now
right.
needs to become an expert in authoritarian fascist coup regime thinking. Because, a story that I've heard is that I have heard that the administration has pretty much gone out and asked Workday, who I imagine a fair amount of your audience are aware of, and I think may have just gone to Workday and said, give us the 100 companies that use your services that do DEI stuff. And then it's up to Workday to say, okay, well, will we give them the list of 100, our top 100
Mm.
customers that have DEI programs? Because or will we say, no, you're going to have to come back with a court order for that? Or are they, or if they, or for example, if the feds or whoever comes in and says, right, we would like access to this, and they don't tell you why, then you've got to be stuck. Then, from my point of view, you've got to start thinking about, well, what access could they get with it? And it's not just what access they could get with it, but what could
Mm.
they do
Mm.
with such information that you've given them access to? So it's pretty terrifying in that respect.
Yeah, assuming that entity had the capacity to even contend with that stream of work with their staff and all, right? Like, I mean, the talent question around technology and knowledge question around technology is just it's stunningly painful
Yeah,
that most entities aren't equipped in-house to contend with this issue as you're framing it. Like not most, like 90, even
99,
NPR,
I would say like
even NPR.
99%. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. And then the question is, then what is the frame or paradigm to engage philanthropists in this new conversation when in fact we're late. We're very, very late.
Yeah, and not just late, but right, we're underwater. It's not like it's
We're
not even like
underwater.
we're
Yeah,
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 it's not
better.
even like we're on the surface trying to stay afloat. It's like we've been
No,
actually drowning for a while.
correct.
Because
Correct.
one of the things that came out in the research that I helped do with these local community news organizations was, yes, they've got all of this special stuff with how they're using text messaging in an amazing way to reach
Mm,
and to form relationships with their readers and their community in a way that traditional news just doesn't do. And that is only able to work because of the Scotch tape, together nature of their operational technology in the first place. So
mm,
they are also consistently under-resourced in the way that the rest of their tech works. So it's like we can self-service, say, Google Apps, right? But we don't, and Google Apps is supposed to be run, apps for your domain or workspace or whatever it's called now. You know, maybe you get a consultant to come in and set it up for you, but maybe you're a tiny fledgling nonprofit and you're like, oh, we can figure this out. So you try and figure it out, right? And you're like, okay, fine, we're paying $20 a month for each of our users. That's fine. And then someone wants to connect something to something else from Google Analytics, so they use Zapier and then they do that to that. And then before you know it, you've cobbled together something that works. We'll say it's operational, but it turns out to be critically operational.
mm,
Right. So if it falls down, then suddenly we've got no idea, whether stories are performing or how stories are performing, right? Or we just don't even have automation that we know could exist because no one really knows how to do it. Or still in 2025, the person whose job it is to make sure that all of this still works happens to be the person who has a job title closest to social media person, because that still includes stuff like text messaging. So I talked to all of them and they're like, we don't have anyone to go to for the tech to work. We don't need a CTO. We don't need a CIO. We might need a fractional one, but we don't even know who to go
mm,
to just get all of this shit in order. It's probably not documented,
mm,
right?
mm,
Just by the nature of all these SaaS services, that you're paying 10, 20, 30, $50 a month for, and you've probably got about like 10 or 12 or 20 of them. They're all brittle. They may change from day to day, and no one actually has the job or enough time. I won't even say training, I'll say experience, right? To be able to sit down and go, great, I now have to spend half a day to a day figuring out why this integration stopped working. Because while it's not working, there's probably reporting that they could be doing that that's actually their job. Or there's stuff that, or there's, data journalism support that they could be doing.
mm,
But because they're the
mm,
person who knows computers the most, then it's
mm,
also like,
mm,
all right, can you figure this out?
mm,
And this has been,
mm,
to come back to the institutional funder part, my understanding is that, general operating expenses, have traditionally been underfunded because people like to fund programs. But when it comes to, just keep it running and also keep the technology that is needed to keep it running and also use it in a way that is better than, well, it works. Because the best use of technology is, okay, well, we're able to automate this. And it's not just automated to save time, but it's automated to make it more repeatable. It's automated so that there are fewer mistakes. For example,
mm,
so many instances of like just copying and pasting.
mm,
Like, yeah, I can copy and paste this thing. It takes 15 seconds. It's
mm,
not worth my time to automate it. But if you did have someone come in, then they could have a look at everything and they could go, right, you don't have to do all this stuff anymore. We've done that. It's written up here. This
mm,
is someone you can call if you need to get it changed. So even that part, it feels like, it's this kind of whole Unix philosophy as well. It's kind of like the least worst way of making it happen. It's like, yes, this is way better than if we didn't have the tools. It's not as good as we deserve. And again, I think this comes back to the one of the things that we were talking about earlier, which was, okay, well, is there software or are there features that really kind of fit inside this non-profit space?
mm,
Is anyone ever going to make them? Are they ever going to be incentivized to make them because you've got to make them and keep them up to date? You've got to sustain them. Or do you rely on, your giant, Google or whomever to say, right, we're going to add this feature because they're not going to do it because you're a tiny, you're not a sector that necessarily needs it, that is
mm,
worth doing that for, unless it
mm,
happens to align with, a giant corporate customer. And it's Google, they're just going to do whatever they want anyway. Congratulations, you get more Gemini stuff, but you don't get, an easier way to get stuff in and out of Google Sheets,
mm.
which, everything runs on Google Sheets. And
And increasingly, nonprofits are a customer segment for enterprise.
yeah, yeah, definitely. And I do think there are better tools. It's like I kind of, I make a joke, like every time someone recommends Airtable to me, it's funny because Airtable is better than Google Sheets. But most of the time when you're using a spreadsheet, you're actually trying to do a database or you're just trying to do some scratch pad of calculations, right?
Mm, mm, mm,
But
mm,
Airtable is a way better database. It is a thing that doesn't exist, and I wish more people knew about it. And it
mm,
is easier to integrate. But again, you kind of got this, well, is this anti-competitive? Google just bundles everything together. And to your point, Billy, it's like, well, is the user the person who pays the bill, or are they thinking about the beneficiary? Because if the user is the person who pays the bill, then they look at Google Workspace and they say, we've got a spreadsheet. You don't need a spreadsheet. And the person who actually has to do the work is like, yeah, and it'll be manual, it'll be by hand. I may make mistakes, right? It probably won't be versioned in the right way, or you won't be able to find it. Or, unfortunately, you know, we could spring for an Airtable subscription as well, right? And that would be better. And then you're back in the, okay, well, what software does it take to run a nonprofit well, and how much does that cost?
The stack. Yeah. What is the
Yeah,
stack?
it's
Yep.
what's the stack? And then I don't know if when nonprofits are putting their budgets together for general operating, right? If they're saying, I'm imagining I'm strapped for time. I have to submit this budget, right? What's the easiest, fastest way for me to submit this budget? Right, I'll take what we're paying for Google Workspace. I'll add a little bit to it, and then that's a defensible budget request for our software subscriptions, right?
Yeah.
Because it'll take time to go, okay, right. What would be great if we don't negotiate down with ourselves first, if we actually ask for what we need, then it would be better if we had Airtable. It would be fantastic if we had someone to come in and show us how to use Airtable. And at that point, you're like, whoa, you're asking for training as well? That's nuts. You don't need that. You're a nonprofit that does this. No one needs training.
Yes.
You don't need shit training, but
Yeah. Let me ask you, I know we're getting short on time, but let me ask you one last question that I'll try to sort of bring together some of the themes that have emerged, at least for me. Essentially, what I hear you saying is this increasing exponential complexity is pretty much unbearable for the large majority of public benefit entities in the world
Right.
at an entity level, organizational level, and then if you drill down to an individual and the technical capacity level, we don't check the box there so much either. And so
And I say, like, don't
we need it.
feel,
So what I'm hearing you say, and what I'm sensing too, not just what you're saying, is that the current paradigm to do security, to do basic infrastructure, was reliant on this sort of Web 2.0 model.
yeah,
Uh, and essentially, we've moved past Web 2.0. And now, not only have we moved past Web 2.0 on the business model side of software and tech, we've moved beyond Obama in terms of how we think of government and interfacing with government
right.
with our data. So then the question is, what's your paradigm for community organizing this field to make this leapfrog into this new era of thinking about security as a primary point of departure and threat models as a sort of fundamental thing when one pursues discovering and adopting technology?
Yeah, I mean, when you put it that way, then I would want to start having meetings with all the institutional funders to provide, no strings, here's how you do hardening, right, to protect the privacy of your beneficiaries for whichever, and fortunately, there are a whole list of really good security experts who I imagine, especially in the LGBTQ plus space, are like, yes, we are right there already. Thank you for inviting us in. It totally works for us. So I think, again, I think the help is there. I honestly think the volunteer help is probably there. I think not that I were to advocate for illegal behavior, but now out of all of the times, I am more open to the moral correctness of white hat hacking to show how bad something can be. So
Mm,
if you were a friend, I'm thinking if I were a reasonable nonprofit and I were able to calm down after I'd received the report, I'd be like, great, because otherwise, that's something that someone we disagree with could easily get that information, or we can see how that information can be used badly. What can we
mm,
do about it? By the way, we have no money, but what can we do about it that way? So I
mm,
do think there's a massive role to step in there. I would be looking at, for example, organizations like the EFF, the Electronic Frontier Foundation. They've provided some great resources. There are, I think you're right in terms of, I hate this term, how quickly to put together stuff like best practices. Because if you ever worked in or near security, then one of the first things they tell you is never ever try to write your own encryption because it will be bad. So, some of the golden rules like that, which are, don't do that. These are the ways that work, right? One of them might even be, you need to think about, and I've been advising, I know that nonprofits have been thinking about this for a while. The downside is that WhatsApp is a really, really great way to reach marginalized immigrant communities. It's owned by Facebook. You may not be happy with that right now. Do you start, what's your audience communication? Do you start suggesting or that people move over to Signal? One of the problems is that Signal, for example, does not have anywhere near the same feature set as what you're probably using for WhatsApp. So you need to be thinking about a lot of that. And also, I think, again, off the top of my head, there's probably a lot of communication that you can do with, well, I'll say beneficiaries again about what they can do themselves. So, for example, there is a setting in iOS in your iCloud bit. If you do iCloud backups, right, you can go into settings, you can go into iCloud, and then there's a little bit that says advanced data protection. And it's normally off. If you turn it on, then your iCloud backups are end-to-end encrypted and Apple can't get into them. So if you do
mm,
that, that's a good thing that you can do. You can tell people to use more secure messaging, for example. You can tell people
Mm,
not, what not to put
mm,
in email. But I think I would probably be thinking about one of the things that I'd be thinking about right now is what happens when we get subpoenaed and how do we minimize, for example, the threat or the danger when we get subpoenaed. And then for community organizing, I don't know, it's really difficult. It's hard to say, read some of Cory Doctorow's books from about 15 years ago and then do what Cory Doctorow said to do in a
mm,
very kind of like cyberpunk way. But I also think, to me, in the US, this political moment as well. I really think in-person meetings, and I know it's still really hard, when we're still in a COVID pandemic, and it's still really difficult for marginalized people and also for people who have health issues. But I do think that meeting in person and making plans in person should be a big part of how we go forward. It's like, yes, we can use tools like Discord. Probably don't think about using stuff like Facebook. If I were an institutional funder, I might be interested in doing something like, okay, well, what is a civic infrastructure bulletin board, Usenet replacement thing for Discord where, you can be sure that, where, for example, the security's been audited, where there is proper encryption, what's a civic version of Signal like that people can use? That might be an interesting thing to look at.
mm,
I think the way to look at it, at least from the technology point of view, is if the imagery of the 6th of January in the US, provokes a visceral response,
mm,
then the same thing is happening to government technology systems.
mm,
And for the people who are doing that, they know how to mess with other people's technology systems as well.
mm,
So I don't think it is too out of the ordinary to say, what would you do if one of Musk's people turned up, right, at your office, or
mm,
someone emboldened by what Musk is doing turned up at your
mm,
office, or turned up at
mm,
your data center, for example, if you're
mm,
significantly bigger? Or what if, for example, in the shitty environment that you're in, what if you get snitched on,
mm.
you know, by someone in the community or by someone in the neighborhood? I think one of the massive bright points is the ability to distribute information among the populace as easily and quickly as possible.
Mm,
I read reports about the head of ICE being very frustrated that people in Chicago all happen to know their rights right now. And I'm like, oh,
mm,
right, yeah. That seemed to be distributed fairly well and fairly efficiently and fairly quickly. That's great. More of that. Definitely ways to let people know about their rights and ways to, that's where content designers come in because a lot of this stuff can be very difficult to understand. So if you're a content designer and you're able to do things, then get together with other people and, make simple to understand, clear, actionable stuff that people can pass along
yeah, and the community organizers as well.
or ask for
We,
help.
we we have a whole generation of community organizers that were digital first, and now it's an opportunity to build the analog community organizer chops, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Because I don't think it's one or the other. I think it's
No,
never been one or the other. It's been very
no.
deliberate about, I've got this human goal. I want to do this thing.
Mm,
It's a thing that
mm,
I want to achieve.
mm,
And then it's okay, well, what can I use or make that will help me achieve that goal? And each one
mm,
of those are going to have pros and cons. And now, much clearer than before, the threat of someone adversarially using that technology against me, that's been theoretical for a lot of people. It's
mhm,
been horrifyingly real for a much smaller number of people.
mm.
But now I would hope that it's apparent to a significantly wider population now.
Well, I hope this conversation underlines what you're saying for people who maybe have heard this message, but it's not an easy one to stick in terms of habit changing and behavioral change, right?
Yeah,
It's just
absolutely.
it's still so damn abstract, you know? And so it's however popular it is to talk about hard things at some depth and with some nuance, it feels like it's like if we don't do that, we
Yeah.
only face harder things. So
Yeah.
so thank you for going here and just sort of with your candor and being so brazen and plain, not even brazen, being so plain about the what's at stake. I really
Mm.
appreciate that. Yeah, I know it's not popular to do that and not easy, particularly when you're an independent. You're an independent. So I really
Yeah.
bow to you with the integrity that you're bringing to this conversation beyond your intelligence and experience. I really appreciate the integrity you're bringing to the conversation, and it's great to know. It's great to now know you, and it feels like there's more here that maybe we can cover another time.
I think one thing that I want to leave people with is this is people know what to do. There are technologists out there who know what to do, and it's not necessarily a hard fix. They know where they need to end up. They know that, okay, right, we need to get this stuff encrypted. Or, for example, they can talk through with you and they can say, do you really need this data? Let's go through all the stuff you're collecting and we'll sit down with you and we'll say, right, do you need this, 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 and this? And if you don't need it, we just won't collect it anymore. They can't ask for stuff that we don't have. And because a lot of this stuff is, I would say, most of this stuff is going to be simple, which means that the fix is going to be simple as well. And I do think that there are going to be a lot of technologists out there right now who are going to be like, yes, I'll stick up my hand, I'll help you figure out, I'm sure in the entire WordPress ecosystem there are encryption plugins that have been audited or that can be proven to work properly for whichever type of data. So it's like the threat is serious and the work will be hard, but most of the work is known.
Yeah, it's back to the prioritization issue
Right. Right.
that you started with. We need to prioritize the security of
Yeah.
our data. Thank you so much for making time for us, Dan.
No problem, Billy.
It's really good to speak with you and get to know how you think in real time. I'm a fan of your work. Is there any particular place we can point people to so they can follow along and learn from you?
Yeah. I say if you want to find out more about my work, then that is at verylittlegravitas.com. And the newsletter that Billy has been talking about is at newsletter.danhon.com. See
Thanks
you.
a lot, Dan.